Welcome to Data in Construction. I'm Hugh Seaton. Today I'm here with Dr. Asif Sharif, Managing Director of LoadSpring Solutions Limited. Asif, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and hello, all the listeners.
So you talk a lot about digital transformation and actually, have a pretty deep background in here. So I'd like to start with something that's pretty topical. How has digital transformation been accelerated in the last few years, especially by the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I think it's a really interesting topic. Digital transformation means different things to different people. And I think one of the things that we have to do is try and make it really simple. Digital transformation for me and for the customers that I talk to is all about using technology to help drive efficiency within their business. And that could be increasing profits, reducing waste, increasing sustainability, making sure that they're reducing risks, making sure that their outcomes are more reliable, their projects are delivered on time, to budget, or indeed before time and under budget, right, to the quality that they need. So digital transformation is a really, really key part of what we're doing. I think that the pandemic, because we've all been working remotely, has accelerated the need for us to think about technologies and the right use of technologies in our day-to-day role, and how these technologies work together, which ones we use, what combination do we use, and more importantly, how they're delivered to us and supported for our users. So I think there's been a huge change.
And I actually want to make sure we cover, for folks who didn't hear Jim in an earlier podcast, who does LoadSpring typically talk to when you're thinking of digital transformation? What is an example of your customers?
So our customers vary. So typically we focus on the AEC sector, the architecture, engineering and construction sectors. And the reason why we do that is it's huge. It's like 13.2% of the global GDP is related to construction services. So it's a massive market. So it means a huge variety of different organizations that we're talking to. So we're, from a very simple point of view, we're talking to construction practitioners. So people like architects, engineers, project managers, risk managers, cost managers. And we're talking to construction companies and large and medium-sized organizations that deliver as part of that supply chain. But we're also talking to the owner-occupiers and the operators of assets. So people that are procuring construction services, like people that own airports, bridges, roads, tunnels, water facilities, but also organizations that are in the engineering space or the mining and oil and gas space. So refineries, people that are looking at alternative energy sources, people that are interested in mining whatever services that or whatever products that are required. So it's a very broad sector.
That's great. And I think that one of the things that is common across a lot of who you described is the project types in certain ways, specifically the length of the projects, often the complexity of the projects, often the number of players that are involved in a project. Do you find that that has a big impact on how digital transformation goes forward?
Absolutely. Again, because this sector is so broad, and we're talking from renovating a room or a house all the way through to building a multi-billion city. If you look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment, there's a huge amount of cities that are being developed along the Red Sea coastline, right? So these aren't just a construction project, a building. These are programs of work that require huge amounts of planning and delivery of various assets, from infrastructure assets like roads and bridges and tunnels and water and gas and power, all the way through to stadiums and hotels and, housing complex, school complex, hotel complexes, all of those included, right? So it's a very broad sector. And yes, the industry itself is made up of a huge amount of different types of practitioners, large, medium, and small. People that are involved in consulting, people involved in construction services. So it's a very broad and large set of organizations that are involved. And as a result, it's quite a fragmented industry. Right. And I use fragmented in a way not to sort of degrade the industry, because the industry is incredibly innovative in lots of ways because of its nature. But a big part of its nature is it's fragmented. It has a separation of design and construction. If you look at manufacturing sectors, they usually have quite a good integration between the design and the manufacturing process. Construction's quite unique. We tend to separate the design, from the construction, from the manufacturing, because it's all done by different organizations in different parts of the world, potentially. So because we're dealing with construction projects that physically are assets that sit in a space in a particular location, we've got to use technologies that help us allow to start to integrate and communicate between a very long and detailed supply chain, but also on a project that we might not be physically next to. We could be working remotely from this particular site that we're delivering to.
And I think one of the reasons we're talking, and one of the reasons we're talking about digital transformation, is exactly this fragmentation. And it shows up not just in who the contractors are, but also the tools they use. So one of the roles I think LoadSpring plays, and why, again, I think we're talking about this topic, is that a way to integrate some of that is through technology. And how do you guys think about that?
Well, it's interesting because many organizations that we deal with don't just use one tool. They use a combination of tools to deliver their services to their end customers, whether that's the actual owner of an asset, or whether it's a contractor, or whether it's an architect. You might be a subcontractor to an architect who's leading the design process. But most organizations are actually using a combination of tools. And actually, the way that they're using these tools and the reason they're using these tools is specific for their particular role on a project. What we're seeing, though, is that the pandemic has actually made everyone acutely aware that we need to be able to access these tools in real time. We need to access them as and when we need to. We need to access them in a way that's easy and consumable for everyone in our organization. And actually, we need to access them remotely via a network, but with all of the security that we typically have when we're working in our offices and connecting to a network and receiving access to our tools via a controlled, secure network environment. So to answer your question, I think that there are lots of tools that we need, and we need to access them in a secure and structured and coordinated way.
And I think inherent in what you just said is the pandemic shut down a set of communications channels, i.e., anything in person, whether it was on site or in the office. And it really made us rely suddenly on, not only rely on other channels, but those channels had to be upgraded to be more secure than they needed in the past, because you couldn't drop by and say something to someone that otherwise you'd need to protect.
Absolutely right. I think it's acutely focused us on the inherent risks associated with working remotely. I think most organizations over the last 20 years have had in their back pocket the idea that actually our infrastructure is ready for remote working. And typically we tested that with about 5% of our workforce. Actually, the pandemic turn that completely on its head. In most sectors, we were talking about 95% of our workforce working remotely and 5% working within our office environments. And as a result of that, there was some slight risks that were identified. There were some changes we had to make as practitioners to ensure that we were able to deliver the tools that we needed to deliver, the information that we need to access on time to the right people in a secure manner. One of the simple analogies is that if you just think about, accessing tools on a home internet connection as opposed to a secure infrastructure that you would access in an office, you're open to many more vulnerabilities by doing that typically at home as you are when you're working in an office. You might be using actually your home PC. You might be using your home equipment rather than your work based computer, which has built-in firewalls and security and that's aligned with your corporate policies. All of that started to disappear. And actually, our use of tools has changed dramatically. If you just think of, I was reading an article the other day, and it said that actually now 1 in every 3 purchases is done online, right? And that's significant. That's so significant because that means that we are now engaged in more online transactions than we have ever been before. And whether it's buying a product or delivering information and delivering a service, we're doing more of that online. And that trend is never just going to go back to what it was. This is a trend that's going to accelerate and is here to stay. So actually thinking about cloud, thinking about accessing tools and thinking about data in the cloud is, I think, really important for organizations to start focusing on.
I love that you brought up the consumerization and how, our everyday purchase behavior is now so anchored and oriented towards certainly routine purchases and things that you don't feel like you need to touch or otherwise verify. I think that that's been a driver, certainly in the construction side, of adoption of enterprise technologies, that people are used to a certain level of convenience or usefulness or performance that they demand now, or certainly expect from what the tools they're using at work. And the idea that we're getting more and more used to um, cloud-based interactions, cloud-based transactions, means that people are going to have very different expectations and also be more comfortable with things at work than they may have been pre-pandemic. Do you think that's a big driver?
I do think it's a big driver, and I think it's something that's structurally going to change our sector and has. This is a seismic shift. This is one of the things that we won't ever go back to, and a lot of people have referred to it as Industrial Revolution 4.0. We've just had the catalyst that's made that happen and brought it into very specific focus for us as construction practitioners during the pandemic. Right, the pandemic has forced us to start thinking about it, and it has some great advantages, but it also highlights some risks that we need to be aware of. And some of those risks are about the amount of data that we're now generating. Over the last 3 years, we've doubled the amount of data that we're generating from the tools that we're using in the construction space, right? That's quite a significant change. And that trend will absolutely increase over time. It's not going to start reducing. We're not going to start producing less data going forward. We're going to produce more and more data. We're actually using more and more tools than we've used before. We're starting to use a greater variety of tools. We're thinking about the integration of tools. We're looking at how we can look at 3, 4, 5 dimensions of information, not just a visual view of information, but we want a cost view, we want a time view, we want a visual view, we want a geospatial view of data, right? So we're now starting to think about a more integrated, more holistic view of how we're looking at project information. It's not just, I need to look at a schedule in isolation. I need to look at a 2D drawing in isolation. I need to look at a bill of quantities or a scope of work in isolation. I now need to think about all these different pieces of information integrated so it gives me a more holistic view of it. And really, BIM was trying to encourage that. BIM was all about trying to say, actually, let's start thinking about construction assets in a far more 3D way. Let's look at information from the architect, the engineer, the planners, the schedulers, the cost managers, and let's try and bring this data together and represent it in a visual way. So data is definitely increasing. The tools that we are using are doing more for us. And also there's new tools emerging every day, right? So every week, every day, we're getting these new tools emerging that are going to be the best at doing that and the best at doing the other. Actually, ultimately, it's up to our customers and practitioners to decide which tools they want to use. But it's clear that tools are evolving and data is increasing, and the way that we're consuming the tool is more on the cloud. So it highlights that actually we need to think about new areas of risk mitigation for us as organizations going forward.
I love that you bring up BIM. I think there's an analogy in that, 10, maybe even more like 10, 15 years ago, there was a push to do BIM without always understanding what that meant. Certainly when it comes to kind of more maturity of the skill set of the team, really the strategic understanding of how you might use BIM. Over that decade, you've seen a lot of that mature. You've seen there's much more training about how to use BIM. There's much more understanding about how it can be part of different processes. So it took a little while. I think you're seeing some of the same thing with digital transformation broadly, certainly seeing it with things like we got to go do a data lake. Not 100% sure what we're going to do with it, but we need a lake, or we need a lake house, or a condo, or whatever word is in vogue today. Are you seeing a lot of that analogy here, that the same sort of process is happening, that it's like, we got to go do the thing. Oh, wait a minute. What is the thing? And who's going to do it? And what are we going to do with this thing once we've got it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because BIM was promoted initially as a thing, a product, right? And it came to the market as a product. You had big vendors delivering suddenly a BIM service, a BIM solution, which is a piece of technology. Actually, BIM is a methodology. BIM is a way of thinking. BIM is a philosophy. BIM is a culture of the way that we should change what we're doing in an industry, and it's supported by tools. And there's a variety of tools that we should use to help us deliver a full BIM strategy. Cloud is very similar. We had this 10 years ago, a big push to be cloud first. But what does that actually mean? And your cloud journey is a journey. It's not, okay, I've bought a SaaS product, I'm now cloud forward, I'm now cloud aware, I'm now an enterprise cloud user. Absolutely not. What we're trying to encourage people to understand is this is a change in the way we're working, and it's a journey that you need to be on as organizations, or we need to be on as an industry. So a big part of what we try and do is we try and assess with customers where they are on that transformation journey, understanding that, look, technology is here to stay, and technology is helping us drive efficiency in whatever we're doing. And the way we're consuming technology is moving from, historically, we buy software licenses and we install them on our own servers and we run them ourselves, to potentially we're going to use all of this in the cloud, and it's going to be a consumption-led sort of approach. We pay for a service and we get it delivered over the cloud. That journey itself is quite a detailed journey, and what we want to do is we want to help organizations in that journey, and by recognizing where they're at now, where they want to be, and then help them in the stepping stones that they need to take to get them from A to Z. This is a journey that is not a one-stop shop. You don't just buy a piece of software that's SaaS enabled and go, done, tick, I'm cloud enabled, I'm cloud first. It's about understanding the implications, the risks, the benefits, and potentially some of the concerns that you may have, and recognizing by applications which ones are you comfortable taking, and then making that decision to help you drive yourself towards an overall cloud solution. But it's something that isn't done in one hit. It's something that is a journey that's going to take many, many years, and potentially will continue for a very long time. It's about a mindset, not about buying a product.
Yeah, I think there's a few points you made I want to call out. One of them that you just kind of ended with is the flip side of things taking a long time is the pressure is a little bit lower. You don't have to get it all right away. You can take your time and make sure that your processes and internal skills are up to speed with where your cloud implementations are. Is that a thing that you kind of help people think through?
Absolutely. I mean, when we start discussing cloud journeys with organizations, they usually come to us and say, look, we've got a requirement to deliver a particular technology via the cloud, and we've got some options. We can do it ourselves, we can go to a SaaS vendor, or we could go to a service like LoadSpring, a managed hosting service like LoadSpring. Tell us what the differences are. And there's value in each one of those offerings. What we're trying to get them to understand is we're trying to get them to articulate what their big driver is. Is it cost? Is it time efficiency? Is it support efficiency? What are their concerns at the moment in how they're doing it, and how can we try and alleviate them? More and more projects now are not delivered by one organization, even from a contractor's perspective. They're done by joint ventures, because essentially projects are getting bigger, they're getting global, they require a more diverse and stronger supply chain. So you don't just have one contractor, you might have 5 contractors who typically are your competitors. So how do we work together with them when we're all remote and the site is in a completely different location? We need to access the same set of tools. Well, let's think about putting those tools on a cloud. So that's the start of the journey. But how you deliver that service, there are lots of nuances and variations, and it's about helping organizations understand what the strengths and potentially the drawbacks are of the different versions, and what it means to them, and what value we can help them deliver. Integration is really important. Having control is really important from the customer point of view. They often want to control the version of software. They want to control who accesses it. They want to control when updates are made. They want to control the integration with other tools. Most tools come from, well, all tools come from a vendor, right? But not one vendor produces every tool in our market. Our market is made up of thousands of project control tools that are delivered by probably thousands of individual companies. So if you're looking at a combination of 5 different tools, typically those are going to come from at least 4 different vendors. So if we want to SaaS enable or cloud enable these tools, how do we do that? Well, we can go to 4 different clouds, or we can think about putting them all in one cloud. And those are the sort of things that we want to explore with the customer. What is it they're interested in? What they're trying to drive? What's their business requirement? How can we help them achieve that?
And the last point you made about pulling it all into one place is, I think this is a genuine shift in paradigm, right? Where in the past, the kind of center point is who your one provider is. And now that you're saying, well, actually, there's a lot of providers out there, and they don't have to be a bunch of little islands anymore, because cloud and sort of SaaS data integration allows you to have it flipped around so that actually the center is the customer who's using it. And you want to put everything into one consumption environment that speaks to itself, instead of it all being in little islands that all have to be managed individually, right? And that's a lot of what you've been driving with LoadSpring, is creating platforms that center on the user, and by user I mean contractor or entity that is using the software, as opposed to the provider. I think that's a bigger shift than maybe is sometimes appreciated, right? Where we
Absolutely.
kind of assume that you're going to be on somebody's construction cloud or intelligent cloud or whatever, and you're saying no, it's going to be on contractor's cloud that everything integrates into, and that's what you guys drive a lot of.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, in about 2018, we did a series of events in the UK to some of our UK customer base, looking at the concept of cloud fog. And that wasn't something that LoadSpring came up with, by the way. It was a concept that was already beginning to be talked about in the market. And it was trying to get organizations to understand that typically within your infrastructure at the moment, you might think you're only accessing 4 or 5 different clouds. Most enterprises are accessing probably 50 clouds, and that was in 2018. The prediction is that by 2025, we might be integrating or accessing data from maybe 1,500 clouds. So this whole concept of cloud enabling us to become really flexible, very agile, and very clear about where our data is suddenly becomes quite confusing, because it's not one cloud, it's 1,500 clouds. I've got bits of data. And paralleled with that, we had this drive within the industry to start thinking about data. When you talked about data lakes, and actually, most organizations at the C level, there is a corporate initiative to say, we need to harness our data. We need to start thinking about creating a data lake. And this is almost like, it's quite a bad analogy, but I want to share it with you. It's a bit like if you went to an English pub at the end of the night, you have the bar staff, and what they do is they go around collecting all the glasses, and they have a bucket with them, and they pour all the dregs of the glasses into this bucket. That's pretty much what's happening in data lakes at the moment for most organizations, because what they're doing is they're looking at the application and going, oh, okay, I need to pull the data for that. I need to pull the data from that. I need to pull the data from that. So what they're doing is they're just pouring bits of inconsistent, incomplete, unstructured data into something called a data lake, and hoping that actually over time, that's suddenly going to make this amazing cocktail of very specific tastes that they need going forward. And there's a big risk associated with that. So we're strong believers in trying to think about, actually, your cloud service absolutely enables you to be agile and is going to give you a competitive advantage. But there is not one cloud service that fits all. Think about the cloud that's right for you and right for your organization, with the right set of tools in it that allows you to control and access those tools and the data, so that at some point or periodically you can start pouring your data into a lake, so that lake is quite clear rather than quite murky and a bit like just a pool of messy water.
Yeah, I think two things come out of what you said. One of them is there's this lingering idea that just store it, you'll figure out how to use it later. Something that made more sense in a sort of website analytics perspective, where things were pretty shallow and it was more about click streams. So going and analyzing was conceivable. Going back into a terabyte of PDFs and hoping to make sense of very unstructured data that even within itself is inconsistent is absolutely, I think, unrealistic. Related to that, though, you bring up another point that you'd actually mentioned even earlier in the conversation, which is asking the strategic questions up front. Because if you don't know what you're going to do with this, it's hard to orchestrate and design processes that will produce good data that you can do something with. The problem with everybody has is we don't know yet, right? So I think one of the things that I hear in what you're saying is, as LoadSpring, as someone who's kind of deep in the middle of this, a lot of what you're doing is helping people on the journey to say, well, okay, if you don't know yet, let's start with what you do know, and gather things there, and we'll grow it as time progresses. So you're not just gratuitously dumping things into an S3 bucket, let's say, that you're never going to do anything with. And now you feel you have to pay somebody to go sift through it one day and manage it. Like there's an expense to data that people don't always think of, and that is that a human often has to go and make sense of what's in there if you didn't do it right up front. Is that sort of strategic evolution a thing that you're spending a lot of time with, helping people to, all right, let's start somewhere and we're going to grow your sophistication as you understand more and more what you can do with data?
Absolutely. I mean, most organizations have at a corporate level a policy that's about digital transformation. It's about using technology smarter, better within their organization to make them more efficient and effective and profitable. But what many organizations don't have is they don't have a formal data strategy. And what happens is that the applications that create this huge, vast amount of data, which is doubling, as I said, every 3 years, is being selected by either line of business or typically IT teams that haven't got the same strategic vision as those sort of executive decision makers who should be helping to define a formal data strategy. And the cloud's a really good example of that, right? So going to a SaaS cloud could be part of your digital transformation strategy, but is it part of your formal data strategy? Because what happens when you go to a SaaS cloud, all of us pretty much bank online now. Have you ever tried to download all of your banking history from a SaaS application that your bank has given you? It's virtually impossible. You can't do it. Have you ever tried to download information from Facebook or Twitter? Really, really hard. It's no different to if you start using SaaS tools to help you manage the vast amount of data that you're generating and creating and delivering on projects. It becomes very, very difficult to abstract all of the data and the databases that reside in SaaS vendor clouds. And that's a big part of a decision-making process that isn't actually being addressed, I don't think, formally by data strategies, because I think if it was, part of organizations' data strategies will be, data's increasing, applications are doing more things all the time, more of our people need to access these tools remotely. So how do we make sure that when we put the data in there, we can export it and bring it back in a complete set? Because actually, we don't just want a layer of that data. We want the whole data and database table, because actually, we don't know what we're going to report on going forward. We don't have a crystal ball to say, like, in 5 years' time, we need to report on this, this, and this metrics. So what we need is the flexibility to be able to say, if I've got all of my data, I've potentially got lots of parameters that I can report on. So I can report on pretty much most of the things that I'm going to need to going forward. That mitigates risk for you. And that's what we're trying to support a customer with. We're trying to explain to them the various options that are available to them, the pros and cons of each, to allow them to assess the risks and put themselves in whatever risk profile they're happy to take. Some organizations are really high risk takers, some aren't. So we're just trying to make them understand that there are different risk profiles based on the different service. But having a formal data strategy is something that I think we need to start concentrating on. It's a big part of our discussions with customers at the moment.
It reminds me a little bit of some other kind of like foreign ideas that boards and very senior management have had to take on. Cybersecurity maybe being a good example, where at first there's a barrier of feeling like, well, I don't know about that stuff. Our IT team is dealing with it. Then threats got to a point where it needed to be raised to the board level, at which point maybe there was somebody on the board who was an expert, but often that wasn't the point of what senior management does. They're supposed to define outcomes and supposed to define a policy level that is then translated through staff that they hire or consultants and partners. So I think one of the things I'd love to just touch on a minute is data strategy doesn't need to be down to the nuts and bolts prescription, but at the highest levels, people should start saying, look, all of our data needs to be properly modeled. Things that they can understand without being an IT specialist or without really understanding kind of, as I say, down to the nuts and bolts. But I want to understand our data governance policy. So go make that and come back to us on what it is. But you see what I mean? I think there's sometimes a barrier of feeling like, I don't know what all that means. We've got a team for that. I'm sure it'll be fine. To saying, actually, data is now important enough that at the policy level, you have to start saying, I need these outcomes. Come to me with a proposal for how you're going to do that. And of course, you resource appropriately so that there isn't this barrier where someone who spent 40 years building things and maybe doesn't really know what the cloud means at a technical level can still say, yes, I don't know that. But if you're going to be producing data, I want to understand how we're moving towards it being useful, it being governed properly, it being managed properly, and so on. Is that something that you see people able to start with? And then, as I say, kind of move forward from there, that they say, here's the outcomes we need, let's resource to get the plans in place?
Absolutely. I mean, this is all quite complicated at some levels, but actually it doesn't need to be. It needs to be quite practical. Ultimately, data is about IP in lots of ways. It's your intellectual property about how you're delivering and what you're delivering from an organization's perspective. So if I'm a contractor, a lot of the data that I'm producing is about the processes, the procedures, and the policies that my organization is doing and how we're delivering to construction projects or a particular project. And that data is really important to me because it's part of my IP. It's also part of intelligence for me because it tells me historically what I've done. And if we think about what we do on projects, typically we rear view mirror. We report from what's happening behind us. We look at historical things and say, that's what we did in the past. Let's not make sure that we do them in the future. But we actually repeat those mistakes again and again and again. The reason why people, I think, are starting to get more and more interested in data is not for the data itself, it's for what the data can enable us to do. If you look at what was happening in different spaces in 2010, 2011, particularly in the medical sphere, we had the creation of huge databases of information about diagnosing medical symptoms, right? And we had them input into computer systems. And there was a program called Dr. Watson, which I think was IBM and a couple of other third-party organizations, developed a system to help diagnose symptoms of problems so that we can actually capture things much quicker. Well, that was made from a huge amount of data structured in a certain way and then using, artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to help us work out what good data tells us and to simulate that more and more and more. So we have a really strong library. So going forward, if we put in some ailments, some characteristics of a diagnosis, what that tool will enable us to do is, and it will enable us to give us a diagnosis which is quicker and potentially more accurate than we can if we go to our local doctor. And that's worked. It's worked already in those spaces. So there's no reason why we can't use the same approach for construction by looking at historical data and making sure it's clean and relevant and appropriate and making sure it's usable and putting it into a data lake. And over time, building that quantity of data and then using reporting tools on that and simulation tools on that and artificial intelligence on that, what we're going to get is very good predictions about what we should be doing better going forward and how we should be doing them. And that's part of our digital transformation, right? That's all still part of our digital transformation because that's about using technology, about using software, and about using data to help us transform our organizations.
You can almost think of it operationally as going from increasing levels of kind of time scale and complexity, right? Like the better the data is, the more you trust it with longer time scales, including starting to point out risk factors in the future. I mean, we're seeing some pretty impressive uses of data on both grown inside of contractors and externally with some vendors where they're taking data and saying, look, I can't predict the future. What I can tell you is when things look like this, either because of where the schedule is or the state of certain indicators, here's what's often going to cause you trouble next. And that's an incredible benefit for a project manager or project executive, right? If you can tell me that the likelihood of a problem is narrowed down to these three things, I can really pay attention to them and will much more likely to be able to mitigate and deal with them. I think anyone understands that intuitively, whether you get data or really understand data or not, knowing that someone can point out to you that of the 50 things you can focus on in this week, here are the three that are most likely to be a problem given where we are in the schedule or other indicators. That's enormous. And I think that's a reason to invest in data that is tangible and understandable, whether you get data or not.
Absolutely agree. I mean, data is the new gold. We like to, or the new oil. There's lots of sort of analogies that we're trying to associate with data, but it's clear data is very, very important for us and will be a competitive advantage going forward, right? So why would you give that competitive advantage up? Why would you even allow the custody of that data to be outside of your control? You shouldn't, right? If you're producing the data, if the data is about your projects and it holds your IP, surely you should be able to control and harness that data, which I think organizations are beginning to be aware of. But if you then transpose that on the options that we have available at the moment to consume and access tools and therefore produce data, it becomes slightly murky and complex, because as soon as you move to a SaaS based environment, a software as a service based environment, the ability for you to control, harness, and have access and custody of your data becomes very, very limited, right? Because you're now multi-tenanted in a vendor's cloud environment. Your data's segmented, but it's part of a bigger collection of data from all of the customer base in a particular region or globally. And most vendors find it very difficult to be able to abstract your complete set of data, your unique databases, and package it and give it back to you at the end of a job. And that's a risk. And that's a risk that I don't think many organizations are considering when they are also recognizing that data is a huge advantage for them. So actually, that's something we're trying to make sure that organizations control. We're not saying every SaaS tool is not right. We absolutely agree that there's lots of SaaS-based products that are really useful and should be continued to be used. And we will integrate with them as and where appropriate. But actually, when there's particular tools that you're using for project control services, design, cost, schedule, risk, geospatial, whatever they are, there are alternative ways to deliver those so they're cloud enabled, but you still control the IP, you still control access and custody of the data.
I think that's fantastic. And it speaks to where I'd love to kind of end. And that is, we've talked already about, and I think you said every 2-3 years, data is doubling. And that's the definition of exponential growth. How would you, in kind of broad brush, think about what that's going to mean for organizations? We've talked now about different ways of looking at cloud and how you're really changing that. Instead of it being hosted with potentially 1,500 vendors, you're now saying, no, host it at the user side, at the customer side, and various levels of kind of maturity. Within that lens, how do we think about exponential growth and how it's going to be important for organizations?
I think we've got to start at really simple principles, which is think about the key data that you want to start harnessing, whether it's cost data, risk data, time data, geospatial data, design data, whatever data that is. And often that data is driven by the services you're delivering, whether you're an architect, an engineer, a project manager, a cost manager, or a contractor or a subcontractor or a customer, right? Many customers now want to hold all of their data that their supply chain is producing on their projects, right? So if I was a utilities customer, I was running water or power lines in a particular geography, I want to get all of the data from my supply chain so that I've got everything about my assets. But what we've got to also do is think about actually what data we harness and how we harness it, because a lot of that data is going to be inconsistent. A lot of that data is going to be incomplete. That data is going to be generated in different systems. It's going to be generated in different database structures. It's created in different software languages, right? So what we've got to do is that once we've got this raw data, we've got to go through a process of thinking about, okay, how do we now start cleaning it? Typically we use an ETL methodology, extract, load, transfer. And that's been around for many, many years. But what it isn't doing is that's just taking data and then transforming it so we can report from it. The transformation process, I believe, which is really key to project controls, is about cleaning the data so it becomes usable and identifying how much usable data we have from the vast amount of data that's growing all the time. And then focusing on that clean data and encouraging more clean data to come out of our projects, and then reporting on clean data, not reporting on lots of murky data. Because it's really simple. If you're trying to run reports on historical performance based on inconsistent data, your reports are going to be inconsistent. They're not going to be accurate. If you work on the basis of, I've looked at my data, I've cleaned my data, it's now in a lake where actually it's very, very clear and it's very consistent, and I report on that, then my results are going to be better. I'm going to get much more consistent results coming out of that lake, and much more predictable information to help me make future business decisions. So it's a huge issue. We want to start simply by thinking about identifying the areas that you want to harness, think about how you deliver those to your team so you can harness them, and then think about analyzing the quality of that data once you've harnessed it, to think about whether it's usable or unusable. Because actually what we're finding is a lot of customer data is actually unusable for a variety of reasons, right? And that's not because they're bad at what they're doing. It's just the way it's structured, or the way it's labeled, or the way it's being reported and recorded is not consistent. So we try and help organizations become more consistent, so the quantity of usable data starts to increase. And ultimately, the aim of this, Hugh, is all about ensuring that we're giving customers the ability to, have that data advantage, which becomes your competitive edge. It will allow you to look at your data and know that you're comfortable with it, know that it's accurate, know that it's correct and is usable, and then make really key strategic decisions about what and how you do your projects going forward.
This is great. This kind of end-to-end view of everything from how data starts to how to think about its quantity and evolution, and how to think about it strategically, I think is a really great overview. So, Asif, thank you for being on the podcast, and for some really great insights into, again, at the kind of the senior level of how to think about data.
It's a pleasure, Hugh. It's been great to speak to you. My final word is, I don't want to make this really complicated. It isn't. It should be really simple. And LoadSpring aim is really to help organizations in this journey, and to try and demystify quite a lot of the complexities that either you're aware of or not aware of.
Love it. Thanks again for being on the podcast.
Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Data in Construction podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your preferred podcast provider. And if you're interested in learning more about data in construction, sign up for our monthly skills webinars or the Data in Construction book coming out later this year. You'll find signups for both in the podcast notes. Thank you.